I never thought a train ride could change my life, until that night. A stranger sat beside me, and what happened next still lingers in my mind. The train station was nearly empty when I arrived, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the floor. Outside, rain poured relentlessly, distorting the city beyond the glass walls. I checked the schedule. 12:37 a.m., final departure. Right on time. Stepping inside, I was met with the familiar scent of leather seats and faint traces of old coffee. The carriage was quiet, scattered with a few tired passengers. I found my seat. 14A window seat. The train rumbled to life, rocking gently as it pulled away from the station. Maybe, for once, I'd get a peaceful ride. And then, he arrived. A tall figure slid into the seat beside me. His dark jacket was damp from the rain, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge me, just sat back, exhaled, and stared straight ahead. Most strangers at least offer a nod, a glance, something. But not him. Fine by me. I turned back toward the window, ignoring the strange tension that settled in the air. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this train ride was about to change everything. The train moved steadily forward, cutting through the darkness, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels filling the quiet space between us. I kept my gaze on the window, watching as the city lights faded behind us, swallowed by stretches of empty roads and shadowed trees. But no matter how much I focused on the world outside, I could still feel him beside me. Too still. Too quiet. I stole a glance. He hadn't moved much since sitting down. His posture was relaxed, but his hands, fingers drumming lightly against his knee, hinted at a restlessness just beneath the surface. Something about him didn't fit. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the strange tension pressing in around me. I wasn't sure why I felt this way, but it was impossible to shake. Finally, I sighed. You don't talk much, do you? For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, without turning, he spoke. I talk when there's something worth saying. His voice was deep, even, carrying no particular emotion. I arched a brow. Wow. That's dramatic. He smirked slightly. You're the one who started talking first. I scoffed. Only because you're sitting there like a statue. He let out a quiet breath that might have been a chuckle, but he didn't argue. Instead, he shifted slightly, finally turning his head just enough for our eyes to meet. Dark. Steady. Unreadable. There was something about his gaze that made my breath catch, just for a second. Then, he spoke again. Nathan. I blinked. What? His smirk deepened, just slightly. That's my name. I hesitated before answering. Anna. Nathan gave a small nod, as if that was all he needed to know. No further questions. No meaningless small talk. And somehow, that felt right. The train rocked gently, the glow of passing streetlights flickering over his face. I turned back toward the window, but my thoughts were already spinning. A name that meant nothing. And yet, for some reason, it felt like it meant everything. The train carried on through the night, the steady rhythm of the wheels against the tracks filling the space between us. The quiet inside the cabin wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy, like an unspoken conversation waiting to happen. Nathan hadn't moved much. Neither had I. And yet, the air between us felt charged, like something had shifted the moment we exchanged names. I stole another glance at him. He was leaning back now, one arm resting on the armrest between us, his fingers still tapping that same slow rhythm against his knee. He wasn't fidgeting, not exactly, but there was a kind of controlled restlessness about him. Like he was waiting for something. I should have ignored it. Should have turned my attention back to my phone, my book, anything but him. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself watching the way his fingers moved, how his gaze flickered toward the window every so often, how he exhaled in a way that made me wonder if he was lost in thought, or just avoiding conversation. You keep staring. I snapped my head back toward the window, my face heating. I am not. Nathan smirked, shifting slightly in his seat. You are. I rolled my eyes. Well, maybe you should stop being so weirdly interesting. Nathan chuckled at that, low and quiet, like he hadn't expected me to say it. I clenched my jaw, refusing to look at him again. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of knowing he had gotten under my skin. But then, what do you think it means? I frowned slightly, turning just enough to see him watching me now, his expression unreadable. What does what mean? Nathan tilted his head slightly, nodding toward the window. All of this. I blinked. You mean, the train? He exhaled, shaking his head with a small smirk. No, Anna. I mean everything. The way people come and go. How strangers sit next to each other for a few hours, sometimes without saying a word. And then, just like that, they're gone. Like they never existed in your life at all. I swallowed. I hadn't been expecting the question. I should have laughed it off, called him dramatic again, but I didn't. Because for some reason, I knew exactly what he meant. So instead, I answered honestly. I hesitated. I think sometimes we meet people exactly when we're supposed to. Nathan's gaze stayed on me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, something I couldn't quite read. Then, finally. That was all he said. No sarcastic remark. No teasing smirk. Just that one small sound, thoughtful, considering. Like he agreed. Or maybe, like he had already known. The train continued forward, steady and unstoppable. But somehow, I felt like I wasn't moving at all. The rain had been falling for hours now, relentless and steady. It wasn't the kind of storm that came with loud thunder or blinding lightning. It was quieter, an endless curtain of water blurring the world outside. I traced my fingers along the window, following the paths where raindrops slid down in chaotic, unpredictable streams. Some clung to the glass for longer, resisting the inevitable pull of gravity, while others merged into larger droplets, gathering momentum before disappearing into the abyss below. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way they moved without direction, without choice. A sigh escaped me before I realized it. You don't like the rain? Nathan's voice was low, cutting through the quiet hum of the train. I turned slightly, surprised to find him watching me. I hesitated. It's not that, I murmured. It just feels endless. Nathan leaned back, tilting his head slightly as if considering my words. Maybe that's the point. I frowned, turning my gaze toward him. What do you mean? He glanced at the window, watching the rain as if it held some hidden answer. It doesn't stop for anyone. It keeps falling, no matter what. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to press him for more, but the way his eyes stayed on the storm told me he wasn't just talking about the weather. Nathan shifted, stretching his legs slightly, his movements fluid and unhurried. The train had slowed a little, though I wasn't sure if it was intentional or if the tracks were just wet. The flickering cabin lights cast shadows over his face, making his expression even harder to read. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. You don't talk much, do you? He smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I talk when there's something worth saying. I rolled my eyes, turning back toward the window. And yet, here we are, making conversation about rain. Nathan let out a quiet breath that might have been a chuckle. Could be worse. I scoffed. How? His smirk widened slightly, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between us, as if testing whether I'd be the one to fill it first. I wasn't going to. Instead, I focused on the storm, on the steady rhythm of raindrops colliding with the glass. I used to love storms when I was a kid. There was something thrilling about watching the world get swallowed up by dark clouds, something comforting about knowing I was safe inside while chaos raged outside. But somewhere along the way, that feeling had shifted. Now, storms made me feel trapped. Like no matter where I turned, there was no clear way out. Nathan exhaled, drawing my attention back to him. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest between us, a slow, deliberate rhythm. "You seem restless." I stiffened. "I'm fine." "You sure?" I turned toward him fully, narrowing my eyes. "Do you always analyze strangers like this, or am I just special?" Nathan held my gaze for a moment longer, before shaking his head slightly, amused. "You ask a lot of questions." I crossed my arms. "Maybe because I don't get many answers." He studied me, then, like he was trying to decide something. The train rocked slightly, the hum of the wheels against the tracks filling the silence between us. Then, he spoke. "Sometimes, people don't give answers, because they don't have them." I blinked. I wasn't sure what I had been expecting, but it wasn't that. Nathan turned away, focusing back on the storm. His profile was sharp against the dim cabin light, his jaw tight as if he was thinking about something else entirely. I wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what he meant. But something about the way he had said it made me pause. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us again. And for the first time since this conversation started, I wasn't in such a hurry to break it. The train carried on through the night, the steady rhythm of the wheels against the tracks a constant backdrop to the silence between us. The storm outside hadn't lessened, and the rain continued to pour, blurring everything beyond the window into a smear of darkness and moving lights. Nathan hadn't spoken in a while. Neither had I. Something about that should have made the air between us feel heavy, awkward even, but it didn't. Instead, the quiet felt inevitable. Like neither of us wanted to disturb whatever fragile balance we had found in this small, dimly lit space. I shifted slightly in my seat, stretching out my legs. I wasn't sure how much time had passed since our last exchange. Minutes? An hour? It was hard to tell. The motion of the train had a way of distorting time, stretching it out in strange ways. Nathan let out a slow breath, tilting his head back against the seat, his eyes half-lidded. He looked completely at ease, as if the passing time didn't affect him at all. I envied that. "You never said where you were headed." The words left my lips before I had time to second-guess them. Nathan didn't react immediately. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. "Does it matter?" I frowned slightly. I guess not. But people usually say something when they're traveling alone. Going home, visiting family, something like that. Nathan's lips curved into something that might have been a smirk, but it was too faint to be sure. "And what did you tell people?" I hesitated. "I just said I was going home," I admitted. "Nothing special." His eyes flickered to me then, just for a moment. "And does that feel true?" I wasn't sure what he meant by that. I opened my mouth, ready to brush off the question, but something about the way he looked at me, calm, knowing, made me pause. I turned toward the window instead. "Of course it's true." Nathan exhaled through his nose, almost like he didn't believe me. The silence stretched between us again. Outside, the rain seemed to intensify, hammering against the train harder than before. The cabin lights flickered once, then steadied. I shifted, suddenly aware of the other passengers, some asleep, some scrolling through their phones, some staring out into the same endless darkness I was. Nathan didn't seem bothered by any of it. I studied him out of the corner of my eye. He was still leaning back, but his posture was different now, less relaxed, more contained. He had one arm resting against the armrest, his fingers still moving in that same steady rhythm. Something about it felt deliberate. "You do that a lot," I murmured. He glanced at me. "Do what?" I nodded toward his hand. "That tapping thing. Like you're playing a song in your head." Nathan studied his own fingers for a moment before lifting his shoulders in a small shrug. "It helps me think." I tilted my head slightly. "What are you thinking about?" Nathan's smirk returned, this time a little more obvious. "You ask a lot of questions." I huffed, leaning back in my seat. Maybe because you don't give a lot of answers. He didn't deny it. Another pause. Another stretch of quiet. I should have let it go. I should have turned my focus back to the window, let him be whatever kind of mystery he wanted to be. But instead, why do you seem like someone who's running from something? Nathan's fingers stilled. For the first time since he sat down beside me, his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for me to notice the way his jaw tightened. My stomach twisted. I had struck something. Nathan inhaled, deep and slow, before exhaling, just as carefully. "I'm not running," he said finally. His voice was steady, but something about the way he said it felt forced. I swallowed. "Okay." A pause. "Are you?" I turned sharply toward him, caught off guard. "What?" Nathan's gaze was calm, but there was something sharper beneath the surface. Something observant. "Are you running from something?" he asked again, his voice lower this time. I blinked. "No," I said too quickly. Nathan's smirk was gone now. "All right," he murmured, but I had the strange, unsettling feeling that he didn't believe me. The train rocked gently as it moved forward. The rain outside remained steady. I crossed my arms, gripping them a little tighter than necessary. For the first time, the silence between us didn't feel quite so comfortable anymore. And I couldn't decide if it was because of the question he had asked me, or the fact that, deep down, I didn't know the answer. The train jolted slightly, enough to make me glance up from the window. The rhythm of the wheels against the tracks had shifted, not by much, but just enough for me to notice. Nathan noticed too. He sat up a little straighter, his fingers no longer tapping against his knee. His eyes flicked toward the overhead lights, which flickered once before steadying again. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The train wasn't supposed to stop before my station. And yet, the motion beneath us slowed. Outside, the rain poured heavier than before, drenching the landscape in an unrelenting cascade. But through the distorted blur of water, I caught a glimpse of something unusual, dim platform lights cutting through the darkness. The train was stopping. I turned to Nathan, my heart suddenly picking up speed. "Is this?" "Not on the schedule," he finished for me, his voice quieter than before. I swallowed. The idea of an unscheduled stop shouldn't have been that strange. There were plenty of reasons a train might delay: technical issues, track maintenance, the storm itself. And yet, something about it felt wrong. The intercom crackled overhead, but no announcement came. No explanation. The train slowed even further. Passengers around us were stirring now, glancing up from their phones, murmuring softly to each other. Even the ones who had been sleeping now looked confused, blinking as they tried to make sense of the situation. Nathan exhaled through his nose, watching the platform come into view. It was small, barely more than a few flickering lamps lining a narrow concrete strip. There was no station sign, no indication of where we were. "Where the hell is this?" I murmured. Nathan didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the window, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, "We're not supposed to be here." A shiver ran down my spine. The train came to a full stop. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. And no one got off. No one got on. The platform was completely empty. The intercom crackled again. Then, a voice, calm but distant. "Passengers, please remain seated. We will be resuming travel shortly." Silence followed. No further explanation. No apology for the delay. Just those simple, emotionless words. I exchanged a glance with Nathan, but he was already scanning the platform, his jaw tight. "This doesn't feel right," I said under my breath. Nathan didn't respond, but his hand tightened slightly on the armrest between us. A minute passed. Then another. Outside, the rain continued to hammer against the platform, the dim lights flickering under its weight. Something in my gut told me that we needed to keep moving. And yet, the train remained still. Then, a shadow. Faint, almost imperceptible, moving just beyond the edge of the platform lights. I stiffened. Did you see that? Nathan's gaze snapped toward where I was looking, his entire body going still. The shadow was gone. But I knew what I had seen. Something, or someone, had been there. Nathan exhaled, slow and controlled. He wasn't looking at the window anymore. He was looking at the open doors. And the fact that no one was stepping inside. I swallowed hard. Why aren't we leaving? Nathan didn't answer. Because neither of us had one. And outside, beyond the reach of the dim platform lights, the rain poured harder. Hiding something we couldn't see. The train hadn't moved. Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have, the silence inside the cabin growing heavier with every second that ticked by. The storm outside roared against the metal frame of the train, but even that noise, wild and relentless, felt distant compared to the stillness inside. No one spoke. No one moved. Nathan sat unnervingly still beside me, his focus pinned to the open doors. His breathing was slow, steady, but I could tell from the sharpness in his gaze that something about this stop wasn't sitting right with him either. I shifted in my seat. Why are we still here? Nathan didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed slightly against the armrest. Then, finally, we're waiting for something. I swallowed. For what? His jaw tensed. That's the problem. We don't know. A chill ran through me. More murmurs spread through the cabin, passengers whispering to each other, exchanging the same nervous glances. The train was never supposed to stop here, wherever here even was. But more than that, there was something off. Something I couldn't put into words. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I turned toward the doors again, my pulse quickening. The platform outside was still empty, still bathed in flickering light. The rain continued its relentless assault, pooling in small rivers along the concrete, seeping into the cracks. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Nathan shifted beside me. Not much, just a slight movement, a small adjustment in his posture, but enough for me to sense the tension in him. His entire body was coiled, like he was preparing for something. The lights flickered again. For a split second, the cabin went dark. A second was all it took. Because in that moment of darkness, I saw it. A shape. A silhouette standing just beyond the platform lights. Tall. Motionless. Watching. I sucked in a sharp breath as the lights snapped back on, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The platform was empty again. Nathan's head turned sharply toward me. You saw it too. It wasn't a question. I gripped the edge of my seat, my fingers cold. I licked my lips, my voice barely above a whisper. There was someone out there. Nathan didn't look away from the window. Not someone. I swallowed hard. Then what? The lights flickered again. This time, they stayed off longer. The darkness pressed in, thick and absolute, swallowing the train whole. For the first time since I boarded, the hum of the engine felt quieter, like something had drained the life out of the space around us. Then, a sound. Low. Faint. Like breathing. I went completely still. It wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It was coming from the platform. Nathan moved before I could. He grabbed my wrist, firm but not rough, and pulled me closer toward the seat, lowering his voice. Don't move. Don't speak. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The train remained dark. The only thing I could see was the faint outline of Nathan's silhouette beside me, his breath steady, his body unmoving. He was listening. And then, something stepped onto the train. Not fast. Not loud. Just deliberate. The air changed. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands clenching into fists. I felt it more than I saw it, a presence, something that wasn't supposed to be here. A single footstep. Then another. Soft. Measured. Like whatever had stepped inside the train knew exactly where it was going. The lights flickered again, just for a second. And in that second, I saw a shadow moving between the rows of seats. Not a person. Not like the other passengers, who sat frozen in their spots, their heads turned toward the ground as if they, too, knew something was wrong. This thing moved differently. It glided. Nathan's grip on my wrist tightened slightly. A silent warning. Don't move. Don't look. The footsteps came closer. My breath locked in my throat. And then, they stopped. Right next to my seat. The air went ice cold. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't do anything but sit there, motionless, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, the train lurched forward. The doors slammed shut. The lights came back on. I gasped, sucking in air like I'd been underwater for minutes. My entire body was shaking, my pulse roaring in my ears. Nathan let go of my wrist. I turned, frantic, desperate, to see what had been standing next to me. Nothing. There was nothing there. But as the train picked up speed, moving away from the empty, nameless station, a faint smudge remained on the floor near my seat. Dark. Damp. Like something had stood there. And left something behind. The train was moving again, but nothing felt right. The low hum of the engine had returned, the steady rhythm of wheels against the tracks filling the air once more, but the silence inside the carriage was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if everyone had collectively decided not to acknowledge what had just happened. As if pretending it hadn't happened would make it go away. But I knew better. Nathan knew better too. I could feel it in the way he sat beside me, shoulders tense, eyes locked on something that wasn't there anymore. And then there was the mark. I forced myself to look down at the floor beside my seat. It was still there. A dark smudge, soaked into the metal surface. It looked like water, but thicker, almost like ink, spreading outward in uneven, jagged lines. The air around it felt colder. I swallowed, my fingers tightening into fists. What is that? Nathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, something silver. A coin. I blinked, confused, as he turned it between his fingers, his expression unreadable. Watch, he murmured. Then, he tossed the coin onto the mark. I expected it to land with a soft clink, to sit there harmlessly on the floor. But it didn't. The moment it touched the stain, it sank. Not into the floor, not into a puddle, it just disappeared. Like the stain had swallowed it whole. I jerked back, my pulse spiking. What the hell? Nathan exhaled, slowly. Yeah. That's what I thought. What do you mean, that's what you thought? My voice came out too loud, but I didn't care. I grabbed his arm, demanding his attention. That isn't normal, Nathan. That isn't supposed to happen. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something in them that I hadn't before. Not amusement. Not curiosity. Recognition. Nathan knew something. And before I could stop myself, the words were out, raw and sharp. You've seen this before. A pause. His jaw tensed. Then, softly. Yeah. My stomach twisted. When? Nathan's fingers curled slightly over his knee. A long time ago. The train rocked gently, but I barely felt it. A long time ago. That meant this wasn't new. This thing, whatever it was, had been here before. I sucked in a breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nathan, what is this? His gaze flicked back to the mark on the floor, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I don't know what it is," he admitted. "Only what it does." I shivered. "And what does it do?" Nathan exhaled through his nose, his shoulders tightening. "It follows." A chill ran down my spine. The train suddenly jerked, the lights overhead flickering wildly before stabilizing again. Several passengers let out startled gasps, a few reaching for the armrests, their faces pale. I turned sharply toward the window. The rain had stopped. Just like that. One moment, it had been pouring, hammering against the train with relentless force. And now? Now, the world outside was bone dry. I pressed a hand against the window, my breath catching. "That's not possible." Nathan didn't look surprised. "That's how it starts," he murmured. I turned back to him, my chest tightening. "How what starts?" Nathan's jaw clenched, but before he could answer, the lights flickered again, this time, plunging the entire train into darkness. And then, just for a moment, I felt something standing behind me. Close. Too close. A presence. A whisper of something cold brushing against the back of my neck. Nathan grabbed my wrist again, his grip tight. "Don't move." I couldn't. Because something in the dark was breathing. Not from the far end of the cabin. Not from the platform outside. Right behind my seat. And then, a voice. Not loud. Not clear. Just a faint whisper. And it knew my name. The darkness inside the train wasn't normal. It wasn't just the absence of light, it felt thicker, heavier, like the air itself had changed. My breath came short and shallow, my pulse hammering so hard I swore it would shatter the silence. I couldn't see. But I felt it. Something behind me. Close. Too close. Nathan's grip on my wrist was the only thing grounding me, his fingers tight, unmoving. He didn't say anything, he just held on, keeping me still. Keeping me from making a mistake. And then, the whisper came. Soft. Slow. Drawn out. And it said my name. Not loud. Not in a way that the other passengers would hear. But right against my ear. A cold breath. A voice that didn't belong. "Anna." I flinched, every muscle in my body locking up as my fingers dug into the seat beneath me. My chest tightened, my lungs refusing to expand, as if something was pressing down on me, something unseen. I wanted to turn. Wanted to see what was there. Nathan's grip tightened. "Don't look." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more weight than anything I'd ever heard. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands trembling. I wanted to listen to him. But I could still feel it. It hadn't moved away. It was waiting. Nathan shifted beside me. His breath was steady, but his fingers were tense against my skin. Slowly, he moved his other hand, so subtly I barely noticed, sliding it into his jacket pocket. He was reaching for something. Then, a single tap against my wrist. A silent command. I didn't hesitate. I swallowed hard, forcing my body to remain still, even though my instinct screamed at me to run. The whisper came again, lower this time. Dragged out. "Anea." My nails dug into my palms. The train jolted. Not a big movement, just enough to send a ripple through the air. The presence shifted. A pause. A shiver. And then, it was gone. The lights overhead snapped back on. I sucked in a sharp breath, blinking rapidly, my vision readjusting. Around me, the other passengers looked unaware, their faces dazed, unfocused, like they hadn't even noticed the blackout at all. Nathan exhaled, releasing my wrist, and I realized his hand had gone cold. I turned to him, my heart still racing. "What the hell was that?" He didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. Silver. Another coin. No, the same coin. The one he had dropped onto the mark earlier. I stared. That's not possible. Nathan turned it over in his palm, his jaw tight. It came back. The train rattled forward, steady now, smooth like nothing had ever happened. Like we hadn't just been trapped in something else. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It whispered my name. Nathan's fingers curled around the coin. I know. My skin crawled. Why? Nathan finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. And then, after a long pause. Because it knows you now. The train slowed, the lights of my station coming into view. I should have been relieved. But I wasn't. Nathan sat beside me, flipping a coin between his fingers, the same one that had disappeared earlier. The mark on the floor was gone, but the weight in my chest remained. It whispered my name, I murmured. Nathan exhaled. I know. I clenched my fists. What does that mean? His voice was quiet. It knows you now. The train stopped. The doors opened. I hesitated. Will I see you again? Nathan flipped the coin toward me. I caught it. It was cold. Too cold. If it comes back to you, he said, you'll know where to find me. The doors slammed shut. I turned, watching the train disappear into the night. And when I looked down at the coin in my hand, the mark had returned.